chairman of the Link Foundation Trust. I'm an academic, and I find being with the Trust one of those really interesting experiences, because like all good academic communities, you learn something all the time. And I have to say, quite definitely, as an engineer, Anne's area of expertise is somewhere orthogonal to my own. The Trust really got its resource from the Waitangi Foundation appeal in the early 1990s, and it's gone on over the years doing a number of things, but some little time ago, about 5 years ago, the then trustees had a really bright idea. They decided that rather than spend their money on little dribs and drabs here and there, they should do something which is quite imaginative. And one of the things that came out of a series of discussions was the idea of the visiting professorships. Part of what we want from the visiting professorships is what we have rather happily called legacy, that there should be something that goes on in the dialogue between the visiting professor and the communities that he or she interacts with, which has a lasting impact and which carries forward even after the visiting professorship has completed. And with the first two of our visiting professors, one of whom was the parliamentarian Margaret Wilson, and the other was, oddly enough, a marine biologist, Jonathan Gardner, this has happened. In each case, there have been dialogue with Parliament or with government departments or with research establishments, and this dialogue has continued after the visiting professor has returned home. And it is very clear from all that Anne has done that this is being achieved very particularly on the occasion of her visit as the visiting professor. Before I hand over the proceedings to Gillian Pugh and Harriet Ward, I should say one thing. I'm delighted this evening to welcome the new New Zealand High Commissioner, David Lockwood-Smith, who's sitting there at the back, but particularly, I think it's the first occasion I've had the opportunity to congratulate him on the fact that he received a knighthood in the Queen's Birthday Honours in New Zealand in the weekend. So, now let's get down to the serious business, and this always gives me a nice frisson when I can hand over to the professionals. We have first Gillian Pugh, Dame Gillian Pugh, who for many years was the Chief Executive of the Quorum Trust. The Quorum, to me, is one of those wonderful British philanthropists who does things and starts something going, which is extraordinary. Although it's not part of the Quorum Trust, I was assured, many of you will be familiar with this bit of plot of land just down here on the left called Quorum Fields. I have spoken about that many, many times in my travels around the world because it has one of those priceless British notices on the fence which says, "Adults welcome if accompanied by a child." And if you think about that, that's a very unusual thing for anything to say. But it was about the philosophy of the importance of children and the relationships between children and adults. And this is what we're going to hear more of today. And so, Gillian, welcome very much. We appreciate it very much. And Harriet, thank you also for the role you're going to play in the course of these proceedings. Please.
Well, thank you very much, and a warm welcome to all of you. It's lovely for me to be back here. I was involved in setting up this wonderful building as a museum. When I came here, what is now the handle bit was the adoption service, and what's now the cafe was my office, and nobody was allowed in case when they left they tucked a picture under their arms, as well somebody once did. But my cousin who used to run Tate Britain, when I got the job, said, "Do you now know that you're responsible for the most important 18th century portrait in the world?" And do you know they've hidden it behind the posters? But this is Hogarth's picture of Thomas Coram, which is an absolute classic. But we're not here to talk about that, interesting though that is. It's a great pleasure for me to be asked to be part of this series. I'm a great fan of New Zealand and New Zealanders, and the whole idea of the lecture series, as you say, is such an exciting one. I've known Anne for many, many years. So that's good. And the thing that Anne has focused on during all of these talks has been the implications of research for policy and practice, which, having spent much of my life working at the National Children's Bureau, which is all about that, I just feel is so incredibly important. I used to have arguments with my research colleagues about whether it was worth doing research that didn't have implications for policy and practice, but we won't go there because tonight I'm sure we're agreed that it is. As I say, Anne and I go back over many years. I visited Australia and New Zealand a lot of times in the 1980s and 90s, and what struck me then, by comparison to in those days what was happening here, which in the early years sector was not a lot, was how together they were. I remember at the day I arrived in Wellington, I was immediately taken to see the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister to argue that investment in the early years was money well spent. Well, could I imagine that happening here? And I mean, it did happen here in the end in 1997, but that was a long time later. So we've, I think in this country, certainly in the early years sector, and we shall hear more on child protection as to whether there are equally lessons there. I think we've got a lot to learn from our colleagues in New Zealand. They've put a high priority on training and the quality of staff being an absolutely critical factor in the provision of services for children. They developed a wonderfully imaginative curriculum document, Te Whariki, which we modelled a lot of the work that we did here on. And as I say, they were particularly good at joined-up policy. Child protection, clearly, are key issues in New Zealand, as they are in the UK, and reading through Anne's notes, and I'll soon get out of the way so she can talk to you herself, there are so many similarities. We still don't. We have daily reminders of the vulnerability of children in the hands of adults, and sadly, the growing inequalities in terms of those who have and those who have not. In a time of massive cutbacks in public expenditure, tends to exacerbate what is already a very difficult situation for very, very many children. We've learnt from New Zealand in social services context, particularly around things like family group conferences, and I'm sure that Anne will talk to us more in that context as well about the extent to which children their children's voices are or are not heard in those settings. I know that when I was on the panel that devised the Family Justice Review quite recently, there was some reluctance to understand on the part of the panel and of those who in the end accepted, I think, our report, and the recommendations are now being rolled out, that children had to be the centre of this system, and that actually to listen to children you needed the skills to do so. You didn't just treat them as mini adults. And I think that's one of the things that we have found quite difficult to struggle with in this country. How do we ensure that if we are going to listen to children's views and encourage their participation, we do so on their terms and not always on ours? So it's a real pleasure to welcome Anne. Her research has focused on the well-being and the rights of children in their everyday lives. And as I say, she has had a particular interest in the translation of research findings into good practice, into good policies and practices for children. When Anne and I first met, she was very much involved in early years issues, but she's considerably broadened out since those early days, and she set up in 1995 the Children's Issues Centre at the University of Otago, where she carries out, or the centre carries out, I think Anne has now recently left the centre to others, interdisciplinary research, outreach, education and advocacy. So I can think of no one better to speak to us tonight from the New Zealand perspective about children's rights issues in relation to child protection. Anne.
Thank you very much, Gillian. It's great that Gillian was able to introduce me, because when I first took on my role as director of the Children's Issues Centre, I came to London and visited the National Children's Bureau and received many good ideas that I was able to put into practice in New Zealand. I'd like to thank the New Zealand UK Link Foundation for giving me this privilege of meeting lots of wonderful people, and I see some familiar faces that have been to the other lectures, which is fantastic. And also for the privilege of being able to speak in this place. I've been to some great places. I've been to the House of Lords, been to the Welsh Assembly, and a few other institutions, but this really has got to be the most memorable place. So I really thank you and the Link Foundation and for Gillian and the others who enabled me to speak here. I want to just start by saying that this third lecture in the series is not so much my area of expertise as the first two, but I still have very strong interest and thoughts about this area. My first two lectures, for those of you who weren't there, the first one was on early childhood education, and the second one was on physical punishment. And I chose those two examples because they were deeply successful in New Zealand. We introduced some excellent policies. And I also just wanted to say that from my perspective, those two areas, the establishing a high-quality early childhood education system and abolishing physical punishment in 2007 were foundational features of child protection. So I won't be talking about them today. So I'm slightly worried about whether this is going to work. Can I just signal to you? Yes. And if you could just put all three bullet points down for me, thank you. So I've been putting up this slide at the beginning because I'm trying to make sure that the themes are seen to run through all the lectures that I'm giving. First of all, the idea that children's rights gives us a moral imperative to make a difference in children's rights, children's lives. Secondly, that research can also make a difference there, and especially when there is joint work between academics or researchers and advocates who are working at the coalface with children, and the importance of relationships between all those three groups, and particularly the policy makers. Right, the next slide, please. It's not working if I just point it. Next slide. All right. I'm sorry, but that's not the right. But this isn't the right slide. All right. Sorry about that. So the other thing I just wanted to start by saying is that I do not have all the answer to this area, this issue, or the many issues around child protection. It's a complex area. Countries like the UK and New Zealand have been struggling. We've been trying, but really, I have to say we have failed to deal with many of the problems. And I'm going to actually read the full quote from Professor Dorothy Scott, who's from Adelaide and ran a child protection research centre there, because I think it's true of my country and it may in part be true of yours. Most child protection services in countries such as Australia and New Zealand have become demoralised, investigation-driven bureaucracies which trawl through escalating numbers of low-income families to find a small minority of cases in which statutory intervention is necessary and justifiable, leaving enormous damage in their wake. The point has been reached in many places where we are exceeding the use of the state's coercive power to protect children without causing them further harm. So it's a pretty gloomy message, really, to start with. So let's see what we should be doing, which we can learn some messages from the children's rights and also from research. So I picked out the key articles in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that are relevant in the area of child protection. Article 19, which says that we should protect children from all physical and mental violence. Secondly, that they need a standard of living adequate for development. Thirdly, that they should have an opportunity to have a say and be heard. These are all themes that will go through what I say. And that children who've been removed from their families, and for care and protection reasons, are entitled to special protection. In other words, we need to provide a lot more than basic provisions for those children. They are entitled to special protection. And finally, the right to survival and development. Now, it's not a good story, statistics in New Zealand about children. And since the 1970s, there's been a steady decline in child well-being indicators for many reasons. There's been, and I'll quote here from a recent Public Health Association report, increases in child injuries, pneumonia, whooping cough, rheumatic fever, and maltreatment, all things that are associated with poverty and inequality. There's been a big increase in the gap between the rich and the poor. There's been an increase in single parenthood. The investment in children has declined. In 2003, you would be amazed that a small, wealthy, relatively prosperous country like New Zealand should have the third highest rate of child maltreatment in the OECD, those figures from 2003. And worrying increases in rates of abuse and neglect. You can see the figures there from 2006 to 2010. This is just to give you a picture. In New Zealand, the most preferred method of handling children who are a concern for care and protection authorities is that they be placed in family whānau care. Whānau means extended family. And the majority, nearly half, are placed in family whānau care. About a third are with foster carers. CYF stands for Child, Youth and Family, which is our department that looks after such children. And 15% are in very temporary bed night or temporary caregiver homes. And another very concerning statistic, Maori are, of course, our indigenous people that are around 15% of our population. They make up 51.6% of children who are in state care. In the most recent figure I could find, we had the 7th highest rate of poverty in the OECD. So there's a bit more bad news, I'm afraid. This is a very recent report from UNICEF, Child Health and Safety. New Zealand was 24th out of 35 countries. I've put the figures for the UK in red so you can see the comparison. And quite often you're a bit better than us, but often not too different. Material well-being, we were 21st out of 35, UK 16th. Child homicide, we were 27th. I mean, obviously, the ones at the top are the ones with the least child homicide. The UK is doing better than us there. I've got the hang of this now. Immunisation, we were 24th. UK was 18th. And not in education or training, 33rd. And the UK is 28th, so you're not so good either. But there is some good news, and listen to this. New Zealand ranks 4th out of 33 countries for educational achievement in reading, maths, science, and literacy. And I feel that because we have this excellent early childhood education system and an excellent primary and secondary system, we should be proud of that and not mess with it too much so that we don't lose that. But the downside of that is that we have a long tail of underachievement, especially for low-income areas and for Māori and Pacifica. So when the United Nations read the government's most recent report, this was their comment. They remained alarmed at the high prevalence of abuse and neglect of children in the family and the lack of a comprehensive nationwide strategy in this regard. And, you know, the government is concerned about that, and things have been happening to show that they're concerned. So I'll just give you a little, very brief introduction to the policy context in New Zealand. First of all, we have the Child, Youth, Parents, and I think that's wrong. It should be CY, Child, Youth and Family Act, 1989. And it is really, that was the year that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted. And it provides a positive framework. The things that the Act says are really, I think, very well-meaning in terms of children's rights. And I'll come back to that issue in a moment. After that, we had a period of radical economic restructuring. People tell me you won't know what Rogernomics is, but you'll know what Thatcherism is. So that meant incredible cuts in welfare payments, reduction of services, and economic policies that were aimed very much at getting the rate of inflation down and at privatising things. In 1990, with a different government, we had what was called the mother of all budgets. And a finance minister who's famous in New Zealand called Ruth Richardson. And this further reduced benefits, took away collective bargaining rights. And I think the sad thing is that through all of this, that as children and families have borne the brunt of economic changes, especially Māori and Pasifika families, and families with young children in particular. And this leads me back to the Act. Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act it is. And this gives you the philosophy of the Act. The Act suggests that wherever possible, a child or a young person's family, whānau, hapu, iwi or family group should participate in the making of decisions affecting the child. So it was very much oriented towards families making the decisions about children. It's been called a family empowerment model. And accordingly, that wherever possible, regard should be had to the views of the family, whānau, hapu, iwi and family group. Hapu just means sub-tribe and iwi means tribe. And that was, I think, a policy that was very much influenced by Indigenous renaissance of the culture and determination that the state wasn't going to take over families from Maori families. And a little bit about the child protection process in New Zealand currently, which I imagine is not too different from what may happen here. First of all, there's notification to the police or to child, youth and family. Secondly, they investigate, they assess, they decide what happens next, and then there's usually either no further action, there's an informal agreement, or a family group conference. And as Gillian mentioned, New Zealand is well known for its what is regarded as an innovative policy of using family group conferences, which has been adopted in many parts of the world. But as you will see, I do have some criticisms of that process. So in the family group conference, families are brought together, information is shared about the concerns for the child. The family goes off on their own, the social worker is there, but the family is left to, well, first of all, social worker may provide information, and the family goes off to discuss it, and then they have to reach an agreement with the social welfare social worker. And the social worker has to agree. The social worker then can purchase services to assist the family, but if they can't reach an agreement, it then goes to the family court. Now, there are different views on family group conferences, and I'll just very quickly give you some of these. First of all, those in favour said that it was very innovative, it was a model of family empowerment, It stopped the state taking over too much power from families, and the fact that it was widely adopted through the world, I think, was a sign that people thought it was a great policy. But on the other side, there have been critiques. Some people, and there's a very good article in Children and Society by Nicola Atwell, suggested that it was a cheap way of looking at, of coming to decisions. It was fiscally driven. It avoided having teams of professionals making decisions about children. It focused on the families to make the decisions. And it was in keeping with some of the economic policies at the time, although they could find good reasons for using it. And often the families on whom these decisions and having to provide resources for these children in need of care fell back on families who were very poor, who were very low in social capital and resources. Now, that wasn't always the case, but it was in many occasions, especially when it was a single parent without the extended family there. And even the extended family has fallen down in many cases. And thirdly, for the lack of focus on children's rights, even though the Act says that children's views should be ascertained and that they should be consulted, there seems to be very little evidence that they ever were. So now I come to put my academic hat on for a moment and say what is wrong with it from my perspective as a childhood studies scholar. It's always regarded as a very good thing to focus on families, but unfortunately it often means that children become hidden within the family. Most of the statistics we use come from families as a whole, so we don't even know a lot about the children there, but parents speak for the family, and so children become hidden. It has been described as behind the veil of family life. They are seen as dependents, as mere becomings. That is, in the process of becoming adults, our only interest in them is that we're going to shape them into good adults. And this masks the individuality of children's perspectives, their particular situation, and their agency, the fact that they also have thoughts and feelings and cope with their difficult situations. Interestingly enough, and there is absolutely hardly any research on this, children hardly ever attend family group conferences. They can, but it's very much discouraged. So here's the one place that decision-making about your life happens and you don't get consulted. So that means that often children aren't told what happened at the conference, why the decisions were made. There's no advocate for the child at those conferences. Unlike I went to when I was at the House of Lords all-party group, there was someone there from the National Children's Bureau presenting a study about how in child protection conferences, child advocates were used there. And they are trying to get that incorporated legally in the UK, that this happens. So that doesn't happen, not routinely in New Zealand. And just to return to that for a moment, often social workers, and I think it goes back to the origins of this place, feel that it's not good for children to know the sad facts about what happened to them, why they might be in care, in contact with the social services, and it would be too painful for them. And there may be some truth in that, but children need at some level an explanation, otherwise they become confused. My allusion to the foundlings here is that I've just been reading Gillian Pugh's fascinating book about the foundling hospital, is that children were never told what happened. They weren't, once their mothers gave them up, there was to be no further contact. They weren't allowed any contact. It was regarded as good for them. They were going to get a new life. They were going to leave behind their illegitimate origins. And I think that sort of thinking is still there. So here I just wanted to, this is a little bit of research we did, talking to children who'd been in, who were in state care, And this is about a 7-year-old Chris who knew there'd been a family group conference, but that he was told to stay in the classroom and play while his grandma went to the library and talked to heaps of other people. When he asked if he knew what was going on, he said, no, not a clue, because they shut the door. And then you have to wait up there until they're finished. Now, sometimes I've got other examples of where children were in family group conferences, but they never had the chance to say anything. They were ignored. So they were physically present, but they felt as if their voice wasn't heard, and that's a very common concern. Now, this comes from the UK Munro Report, which is a great quote, I think. Children and young people are a key source of information about their lives and the impact any problems are having on them in the specific culture and values of their family. It is therefore puzzling that the evidence shows that children are not being adequately included in child protection work. And I think with your act, where the local authorities have to consult with children, you're, I think, better off than us, and I think very good. Whether it always happens, of course, one doesn't know, or you may know. So the experience in the child protection field is pretty near universally most children want to be with their families. And I'm just going to pick up this bit of paper because somebody sent me this wonderful rap of Maori children who are in a residential care, and this is part of the rap. God, please, can you set us all free and send us back to our families? And it's done as a rapping, and I thought that was fantastic, and it did illustrate that point, that most children want to be with their families, even though they've been neglected or abused. There's plenty of evidence to show that the state doesn't do a good job as a parent. It's an ineffective parent. It just can't provide the kind of love and trusting environment that children flourish in. And families themselves often are in an ecological context which is difficult, especially when there's high levels of poverty and unemployment, as we have increasingly so in these financial hard times. In New Zealand, I think that we have a lack of balance between this noble idea of family autonomy and actually protecting children. And actually, one of my colleagues in the law field has said there's a huge contrast between the domestic violence legislation, which is focused on immediately stopping usually the spouse's exposure to violence and the state intervening very quickly, and what happens in terms of child protection, where there's this emphasis on understandable emphasis of not taking children away from their families. But unfortunately, if they're to be with their families, then the families have to be resourced and they need a lot more. Whoops. And this is my conclusion, is that what is needed is intensive intervention, and I think a lot of people in New Zealand now know this. Plus, so universal services and additional funding for some children who have particular needs. I'm sorry, I can see people craning their neck at the back there. That it's not easy to read the slides. All right. So recently, we've had a spate of increasing concerns. Started off about in the mid-2000s with the terribly sad death of 3-month-old Maori twins. And nobody has ever been prosecuted. Their father was tried for murder and he was acquitted. Nobody ever knew exactly what happened, and the whānau kind of closed their doors, and information was not really had about what actually happened to these children. And near Glassy was another very sad case of Maori child abuse, which heightened our worries about... Sorry, I don't know why this one's not going. Ah, yeah. So there have been a number of series of forums and meetings. Even before that one, there was a review of the Children and Young Persons and Their Families Act. which recommended a number of changes, which never happened because there was change of government in 2008. But the new government also set up an expert forum on child abuse, and many of the recommendations were the same. Sorry, those are in the wrong order. One of the current Prime Minister's challenges to the public service in 2012 was supporting vulnerable children and reducing the number of assaults on children. And so there were, I can't remember how many it was, challenges to the public service. So the Prime Minister put this up front. The government was concerned. So what happened then? We got a series of papers, a green paper, a white paper, and now we have a children's action plan. Here's a picture of the three ministers, Minister of Health, and the Minister of Social Development, and the Minister of Education. One of the things, as I'll show you, is the idea that all of these government ministries need to be involved in addressing the issue. It's a very photogenic group of ministers. So what did the green paper say? First of all, it was written by an anonymous independent expert, which I must say I find that difficult, because when I talk about Te Whāriki, our early childhood curriculum, it was written by two academics who won the contract to do it, and they consulted very widely. This time it's written by an independent expert. Oops, sorry. Now, the focus of the green and white papers is on vulnerable children. It's called the Green Paper on Vulnerable Children. And these children are said to be at risk because of abuse, neglect, disability. They're not doing well for some reason, and the government expert identified that about 15% of children were in that category. The UNICEF in Wellington collated the responses. People were allowed to make submissions, and there were 900 of them. And these were the sort of criticisms that were given. First of all, the narrow definition. People felt that you couldn't identify some 15% of children that were vulnerable, that children moved in and out of vulnerability. It wasn't an easy thing to define. Secondly, the fact that the policy is focusing on deficits. Thirdly, the fact that the policy in the green paper, there's one mention of children's rights. In the white paper, there is no mention of children's rights. The absence of a children's rights focus. And if there is any area where we've learnt the lesson that children's rights needs to be a focus, it's got to be child protection. Because children, as I see when I read the newspaper in this country, have not been listened to, not been believed when they have disclosed abuse. And so there has to be a strong mechanism for their voices to be heard. And it was also criticised as, and I'll tell you some of the things that are recommended, as focusing on surveillance of families rather than supporting families, keeping them together so that they can provide the necessities for their children. And I come back to the childhood studies critique of this approach. Wendy Stainton-Rogers talks about discourses of concern, risk, and vulnerability. And she says they lead to a very partial and distorted concern to protect a child from abuse at virtually any cost. This, she says, renders invisible all other concerns about other needs the child might have, such as access to information, and indeed about their fundamental human rights. And I think that worries us a lot when this group of children is always we do know that there are vulnerable children. I certainly don't deny that. But I think they are sort of lost in that process of being defined as to be protected. And there are some negative side effects of that. First of all, that creation of a climate of fear, that everyone is worried for the next cases of abuse that are coming for children. And this is a big one, because one of the key recommendations is that there is more sharing of information about children. Children become public property, they lose their privacy. Everyone knows about them. And yet I can see the logic of that, because in many of these cases there has been a lack of communication, a lack of sharing of information. But it is very important that children just don't become these public property. The restriction of children's play and the suppression of affectionate contact, because that might be construed as abuse. These are some of the things that come from that discourse of risk and deficit. The de-skilling of children, the fact that we see them only in terms of their deficit and not their resilience. And also the diversion of attention from serious risks, and that is if we're always looking out for someone, for examples of abuse, then sometimes we miss the most obvious. So the white paper, what did it recommend? It didn't recommend mandatory reporting of abuse for the whole population. It was felt, and I know the UNICEF analysis of submissions felt that this would just simply flood the agencies, and there have been experiences in Australia where that has happened. They've been flooded with notifications and they just can't deal with it. They did suggest, however, that notifications, it should be compulsory for agencies to do that. They're setting up a Child Protect telephone line, a vulnerable children's information system, that's the sharing information I mentioned before. There's going to be a new risk predictor tool, and I have to say I'm one of those people that is very suspicious and worried about assessment tools which are supposed to predict who is at risk. This is going to be done with academics from the University of Auckland because A, they miss some children, and B, they over predict. And there are to be now children's teams of community professionals. And that is something that had been recommended for a long time, but because of the family empowerment model, it didn't really happen in New Zealand. Also because it costs more money, because you have to pay those people. And this last one's an interesting one, and I'll come back to it. I forgot to ask John, how much time have I got? 5 minutes, right? I'm getting there. And that the interventions wouldn't be instituted unless there was an evidence base for the intervention. So there was a strong emphasis on, we're not going to just have all these community services, it's going to be hard evidence. So again, to come to the critique, a lot of people say that, I mentioned the narrow focus, that it's really just tweaking current systems. There's been a lack of attention to primary prevention, which we can do really well in New Zealand because of our great education system and early childhood. The lack of focus on Māori has been criticised, and I'm only quoting from the submissions that UNICEF collated. The lack of attention to the context of children's lives, poverty, unemployment, and the fact that it was very vague how they were going to be implemented. And I've seen the Children's Action Plan, and I went and talked to the people who work in the Children's Commissioner's office, and they told me what was happening, and she said a lot of things were happening, but it's yet unclear what they're going to be. And most worrying of all, because if you really want to do something, you need funding. There's to be a lack of new funding. And how are you going to fund the policies? Well, you're going to withdraw funding from some of the projects that don't have an evidence base, which is very worrying for many community organisations. And finally, the total absence of any mention of children's rights. So, just quickly about the research evidence. You haven't heard much from me about research, just a little bit. There is a research vacuum in child protection in New Zealand, and there are many reasons for this. It's just not the kind of research that gets funded. It's also extremely difficult. I've had a number of doctoral and master students wanting to work in this area, and they have been prevented any access with children in the care and protection system. I've seen some very good work in England where access has been gained, but there are so many people who've got to get permission from that people give up on it. In terms of what the research shows, and these are very general statements, I do have a detailed paper if you want to hear my arguments in more detail, that a process that supports and provides welfare for families is much more likely to be effective than one which punishes them and blames them. Thirdly, there's a lot of research showing that our social workers are totally overwhelmed by their investigatory functions. So they've got to find out whether there really is a concern there. And so they have very little time left for any preventative work with families, for developing a relationship with families. And so working for an agency like Child, Youth and Family is actually difficult. And there is a huge turnover of staff. And we've got a problem with training where that is being addressed and training is improving. But the main thing is really just the system. There's so many investigations. So they have a heavy caseload. There needs to be more training. There needs to be a rights focus. That social workers who work with the children need to understand that children are the focus of all this work. And the one thing we know, and I was on an early childhood task force in 2011, which found so much evidence that early intervention is cost effective. So, you know, it's worth investing money. That will be returned many times over. And a little bit of research on state care, the importance of high quality in foster care, the fact that foster carers need a relationship with child protection workers, which they often don't get, again, because of high caseload. The lack of support for carers, especially grandparent carers, who are often very poor themselves. And the fact that a big issue is when children are in different placements and that they are moved between schools, they need a lot of help with health and education issues. Well, with education issues, I've got a PhD student doing a really interesting study on kids in state care who have been successful. And one of the factors was whether they could manage to stay in the same school. Some children in state care have been out of school for 6 months, and nobody's really realized that. And, sorry, I'm rushing now, but the children need to know things. They need to know who their birth parents are, why they're in care, what the professionals do, because they didn't understand in our research. They need to know what family group conferences are about and what decisions were made and why. And they talk about difficulties in a study Nicola Atwood did that happen if you're in foster care, like relationships with siblings, lack of freedom, moving education, and so on. Sorry, I'll skip that and go to Nicola Atwood's. If anyone wants the slideshow, I can send it to you. The children wanted to be provided with information and listened to by adults and prepared to act on what they heard. Children very clearly said that adults do not listen, but despite this, they wanted the adults they lived with, and that would often be the foster carers, and trusted to be the ones who had the most say about decisions that affect them. They did not want strangers making decisions about them. So the worry about the evidence base in the white paper is that money is going to be withdrawn from projects that are already there, that can't show hard evidence that they're successful. I'm not saying I don't think evidence is important, but see, sometimes these programs aren't funded to have evaluation within them, and they're doing a good job in the community now. And just because there isn't a randomized controlled trial showing that it's effective, it's not going to, I think, it's not going to be fair to withdraw funding. So, to conclude. So the family empowerment model, although basically very sound, needs an overhaul and needs to put children in there. If we've got fiscal constraint, I think that means nothing will happen. Things will get worse. Withdrawing money from one program and putting it in another is not going to do it. And I understand that there's fiscal constraint, but let's not pretend that we're actually doing anything. I think there needs to be, and I take the that words from the phrase that the National Children's Bureau study, a legislative driver. If we're going to have a Vulnerable Children's Act, it needs to say that children's voice needs to be represented. And I think the way forward is a public health model with a multi-method empirical base. And just to finish, this little bit more from the rap I mentioned earlier, and I wish I could do a rap for you, but this is, I think, the positive kind of thing you need to see for these young people. I'm a thrive, belong, believe to achieve, no limits, aim high, boy, reach for your dreams. I'm a spread my wings, open them and fly. I'm setting no limits as I reach for the sky. Thank you.
In common with the UK, but such a perceptive analysis of the challenges that you're facing in New Zealand. You mentioned the independent advocacy. I do happen to have the 2 NCB reports here, if anybody wants to come and look at them later. But it's now a great pleasure to introduce Harriet Ward, a research professor and director of the Centre for Child and Family Research at Loughborough University, and also co-director with the Institute of Education and Kent University of the Childhood Wellbeing Research Centre. Harriet's an enormously experienced researcher, most recently having undertaken an overview of research on safeguarding children for the Departments of Health and Education, and involved in a fascinating longitudinal study of babies coming in and out of care. But her remit tonight is not to talk about all of those things, but to reflect on the basis of the New Zealand experience, to reflect, give us her reflections on what Anne has said. So over to you, Harriet.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, I'm delighted to be asked to do this, and secondly, I was even more delighted because I'm one of the lucky people who got an advanced copy of what Anne was going to say, and I haven't read it very long ago, but it has already been extremely useful to me because it is such a valuable analysis, really, of what happens in New Zealand. I suspect that, well, no, possibly I'm the only person who came here today who knew very little about the child protection in New Zealand, and basically what I knew was that there were likely to be particular issues with the indigenous population, because I know that happens in Australia, and also I knew that family group conferences came from New Zealand. Well, what a lot you have taught us since then. Thank you. There are lots of sort of issues that this talk raises, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes, and you'll be delighted to hear I've only got 10 minutes anyway, to just reflect on some of them. One of the things that I think Anne has done, which we don't do enough in England, is to set the whole child protection issue within a normative question, looking at children who require additional support, children who are likely to be abused or neglected, not as children who are likely to be abused and neglected solely, but as part of the wider population of children. So to begin by looking at some of the normative statistics about what happens to all children in New Zealand emphasises that, and I don't think we do nearly enough of that in England. I started out as a researcher who focused on children in care, and well, 20 years ago we really regarded children in care as a sort of separate species, really. They were children who were completely different from other children, for no reason really, except that was how they were looked at in both research and I think policy terms. Since then we've broadened that out a bit and started to realise really that many children in the care system are also children who have experienced abuse and neglect, and in many ways our care system is part of our child protection system. That's joined up a bit, but and Every Child Matters, of course, helped us to think about all children and the needs and objectives of all children, but we don't make sufficient use, I think, of the national and international statistics. I know it's very difficult. Emily Munro is here in the audience, and I know that she has spent an awful lot of time trying to see how statistics on child abuse can be comparable between different countries. So that's one of the issues that I think is really interesting. And then that leads, of course, to the question of how you deal with abuse and neglect, how you strengthen, what services do you strengthen, what programs do you introduce? And there's the question of how far can these issues be dealt with by universal services for everybody, hoping to address issues for children who are likely to be abused or neglected within a whole program for all children, and then how far you need targeted services or intensive services. And if you can nest them all together, that reduces the stigmatization and I think makes it much easier, both for children and also for those people working with them, to look at them as children first, and that's something that we forget to do, I think. It's very helpful, as Gillian said, I wrote the overview for the Safeguarding Children Research Initiative, which was a wide body of research, 15 studies commissioned by the Department of Health and the Department for Education following the death of Victoria Climbié. And one of the eye-openers for me in doing that was that we had to talk a lot to medics, and I come from a social work background and we don't tend to speak to each other. This interagency issue runs right through research as well as through practice. And the medics introduce a different view in many ways. And one of the things I learned from them that I think is very valuable is that child protection can be viewed as a public health issue. Once it's a public health issue, it's something to do with everybody. And that, I think, makes it much easier to design services and to help children. One of the other questions that Anne has raised that is really important is, how do you get this balance between support and surveillance? How do you help a family and at the same time have to make sure that the child within the family is safe? That's something that we are still struggling with, I think, in England. And not having resolved that, really, I think is one of the reasons why we get into such tangles over our child protection programs. Because I think what happens is that we focus on risk rather than need, because the surveillance thing comes to the fore whenever there is a tragedy and whenever there is a media storm. Everybody sort of retreats and doesn't look at children's needs, rather they focus much more on risk. And the way you manage risk is to increase the process, so you have more and more procedures in order to try to make sure that if you're a professional, you have done all that is asked of you. And that helps protect you and helps you feel safe, but it doesn't necessarily help the child to be safe. And I think we can focus far too much on our processes. It's impossible, I think. It's impossible to make sure that all children are safeguarded, but it's perhaps even harder to accept the fact that some children will not be safeguarded. But I don't think we can really get away from that. And like you, we have had this issue about how our professionals end up with so many procedures that they spend a lot of time, at one stage almost all their time, investigating whether abuse had occurred rather than designing services to try to help children and families overcome abuse. That sort of leads to the question of prevention, doesn't it? Do you focus on prevention or do you focus on compensation for those children who have been abused? And again, with the economic climate, the tendency is to cut the preventive services because they are seen as a cheap, easy target. And anyway, how can you cut the services for looked after children and still keep them safe? So I think that's an issue that we haven't grappled with. The other issue that I was really pleased that you talked about is this question of balancing the child's rights with those of the whole family. That's come to the fore very much in the last few years in England, and again is something that I don't think we will ever get right. Our Children Act 1989 is the same year as yours, and because I've been around a while now, I remembered when it was introduced, and I was just starting my PhD when it was introduced, and the debates then were about how the state was damaging families, was not allowing parents to stay, was taking away responsibility for families, from families. And the children, and part of some of the provisions of the Children Act, which incidentally I think is a brilliant piece of legislation, but part of the provision was to try to include parents more, to make sure that parents were involved in the decision making, and of course children as well. We have clauses saying that children need to be involved. But it was also introduced at a time when there were ideological, political issues about ensuring that people took responsibility for their lives, and it fitted in with that discourse as well. And I think that, in fact, I think we're beginning to see in England a point at which the family has been preserved sometimes at the expense of the child. And we have, a lot of the evidence that came from the Safeguarding Children Research Initiative showed that. And one of the things we said was that professionals need to focus on they need to make sure that rather than safeguarding the family, they should be safeguarding each and every child within it. And that, I think, is incredibly difficult as a professional to understand and to deal with. And I was startled when I heard that family group conferences aren't always as wonderful as we think they are, because I have been brought up to think that they are a marvellous solution. But of course, when you think about it, you can see that there will be issues and that children may be left out. And presumably there are also all sorts of tensions within a family group conference that are difficult to deal with. We have to accept that some families, and it is a very, very small proportion of families, are not able to provide adequate care for their children. And that then leads to the question of placing children in care, and certainly in England, placing children for adoption. Questions about kinship care you raised too. And again, there are issues here, the same sort of issues. Kinship carers aren't adequately supported. Our adoptive families are getting a huge amount of support, but our kinship carers, our special guardians, aren't going to get parallel support, and yet they are dealing with very similar children with far less resources. So there are issues there as well. And I've left the children till last, not because, of course, they're the least important, but I wanted to end with you thinking about the children, really. And one of the things I think that Anne's talk has done, but that is also part of a drive, really, that the United Nations Convention is also behind, is focusing on the rights of a child. And if we can focus on that rather than needs, I think we might be getting somewhere. Because once you frame the whole debate within a rights context rather than a needs context, things aren't so much done to children, but done with children. And yes, with children leading. It's difficult for me because when I was a child, I'm not quite the generation where we had to be seen and not heard, but we certainly weren't expected to participate in anything much, and certainly not decisions about our life. But obviously it becomes evident that if you don't consult children, if they're not engaged and involved, then anything you do is not necessarily helpful. We do have a UK requirement to consult children, but I don't think that they are adequately consulted. There's lots of evidence that they're not. There's lots of evidence that children in care don't know enough about their circumstances. And perhaps that's the thing that we need to take away from this. One of the main things is that children have a right to take part in their own lives, to understand what is happening, even to understand some of the difficult things that are happening. Unless they do, and if they know about their history and their past as well as their present, they won't be able to make sense of it, and they won't be able to move on. Thank you very much indeed, Anne.
Thank you very much, Harriet, for that very valuable perspective. Right, we've now got about 10 minutes, I think, for questions. Chairs are appearing. Anne, do you want to, and Harriet, would you like to come up as well? And I'll sort of hover and catch people's eyes, hopefully. And there's a roving mic. Are you going to rove? Right. And if you'd kindly say who you are, just so it puts it in context and what your question is. A lady at the back.
I don't necessarily need the mic. My name is Stephanie. I'm a physiotherapist by background, although I haven't worked for a while.
Okay.
I'm just interested in Harriet's last comments there, where she was describing whether services
both have, do you want to start, Harriet, and then Anne might like to say something?
I think we're all hoping somebody else is going to answer that question. Because I don't think there is an age. I think that protecting children from information is problematic, because I think we did research on children in care a few years ago, and 37% of our respondents didn't know why they were in the care system. Now, some of them were being protected from situations that they will have forgotten about, but growing up not knowing why this has happened creates greater problems, I think, than growing up knowing what has happened. And we have programs to, children are always supposed to be consulted at childcare reviews, for instance, but it's very often a token consultation. I think there's a very great difference between consulting children and talking to children and letting very immature young people make life-changing decisions that they don't have the maturity or indeed the knowledge to be able to understand. I'm not suggesting that they always need to lead the way and to make the decisions, but they certainly need to be involved in the decisions and to understand why, why their wishes may not necessarily be the ones that prevail.
And I agree with Harriet that there isn't an age. Oh, I don't need to do that, yes. There is no age at which you can talk about consulting with children, but even before children have language, it's very easy, well, not easy, but possible to see what their preferences are. And I think one of my colleagues, Nicola Atwell, does a lot of work with looking at attachment. Who is the infant attached to if you're really going to place an infant with someone? So even before you can actually ask them what they think, you can observe the way they play, who they go to if they're upset, and that sort of thing. And I know we've got Priscilla Alderson sitting here in the front row. She's going to say that even babies are very capable of communicating their needs to people. You might like to comment, Priscilla.
Do you want to? Not now? Could I just add that when I was here at Coram, we did a really interesting piece of work that keeps being republished called Listening to Young Children, which is a resource pack for use that's been used in nurseries, in schools, in social service settings, in our child contact centre with children being adopted. And this was working with children from a few months old to 5. And it's about helping develop the skills of practitioners in observing, in listening, in picking up cues. And there are all kinds of ways that one can listen to children other than verbally. Anyway, other questions?
Thank you, Mary Baginski. It's to pick on your point, Gillian. About 10 years ago, I did some research into child protection and teachers, and the fear amongst newly qualified teachers about talking to children because it had not been part of their skill set. And I'm now finding that same apprehension in newly qualified social workers in similar work I'm doing. Not that they're frightened of children, but it's the communication, and the training isn't in their initial training to support that. And I think the other deficit, which also touches on what we've been talking about this evening, is the lack of input on child development, particularly now with social work training, and as it becomes more curtailed and shorter. Already, I've just done an evaluation of a route into social work, and the majority are saying they're not getting sufficient input on child development. And given that they then have to go out and make complex assessments when they are newly qualified social workers, it's something we need to be concerned about. It's an observation, I don't
Oh, I totally agree. And I think because social workers work so much with the family, they do have that danger of always focusing on what the adults are saying, and that they do need particular training or awareness or something. I think if they had some childhood studies, that they would understand this. Yeah, yes.
I'm Maria Lanango from Children's High Level Group Association. I would like to ask about the adoption policy in New Zealand. Under what conditions is a child declared adoptable? And also for Professor Ward, how do you regard this pressure on more children being declared adoptable? I know in some countries there is this tendency to view adoption as a preference, also because it takes the responsibility away from the state, and apparently it is a solution which is often seen more rosy than it is in reality. And yeah, how they regard that. There is also, within the European Union at least, a tendency that there should be an ending to residential care and all children should be placed in families. Rather, even measures like long-term foster care tend to be excluded. So how do you regard this? Thank you.
I think that's a whole seminar on its own.
Yes. Do you want to?
But who would like to have a 2-minute stab at an answer?
I'm absolutely no expert on adoption. I don't think we've changed our law since 1958. So a lot of people are very concerned, but adoption is very rare now in New Zealand, as far as I know. There is a pressure for foster parents to take on permanent guardianship, and that means basically they take over full responsibility for the child. But it's quite unusual for them to actually adopt the child because there's that feeling that adoption is not a good option for them. Now, what was the second part of your question? About residential homes. Yes, definitely. There are very, very few residential placements now in New Zealand. I have the number there, and I know it's less than 100, but it's been interesting. I was just reading a study where children were happier in a very good quality residential home than they were sometimes in foster placements. And so I don't think we should entirely reject that, yes.
Harriet, do you want to comment?
You asked about our current policy on adoption. The current policy is to increase the number of children who are placed for adoption and to speed up the process of adoption. We adopt about just over 3,000 children a year of our own children in England. There is evidence that a number of children stay for lengthy periods in very damaging situations where parents are unable to overcome the sort of risk factors that make abuse likely and that lead to the occurrence of abuse. So we either need to help parents overcome those difficulties and to ensure that the children are safe, or we need to remove the children. I think at the moment, I think the evidence would suggest that there are a very small number of children who might benefit from adoption who aren't placed for adoption, but the current policy is only dealing with a very small part of the picture, and in my view you need to have joined up policies which deal with the whole picture, and introducing a policy that focuses almost exclusively on adoption rather than also on providing programs to prevent the need for children to be removed is unfortunate. And I also think that a policy that focuses on adoption to the exclusion of special guardianship and other parts of our care system is also unfortunate. And I think you need to address the factors that increase the stresses in families that make abuse more likely, which means that policies that are likely to increase poverty, for instance, and homelessness and isolation are going to increase pressures and make life much more difficult.
Thank you. I think that it is a huge policy issue. It's as if every new Prime Minister who comes in decides that this will be the answer to everything. Tony Blair launched his adoption paper in that room over there. David Cameron has been here, I believe. I don't hear anymore. And it's as if this is seen as the answer. But it's so dangerous to separate off discussions about adoption from looking at children who need alternative family and other support across the piece. I think we've kind of beaten the clock now, do I now hand over? So, no, before I hand over to anybody, can I ask you again to give a very warm round of thanks to Anne and to Harriet. Thank you very much.
to invite you to join us for refreshments, which are through the door behind me where you came in. Thank you again. And we hope to see many of you at the final lecture in this series. Thank you all.